Welcome, Voyager. Tonight, we drift toward a place where the sea doesn't glitter blue, but glistens black, and where a sailor could throw an anchor and find it clinking not on coral, but sinking into something sticky enough to hold fast without a chain. If you've ever dropped your toast butter side down, you'll already understand why no sailor liked docking here after dark. Before we begin, remember to drop a like and subscribe so we can keep voyaging together. Leave a comment. Let us know where in the world you're listening from. If your shores permit, we just may set sail there next. Now, settle in, loosen your grip on the wheel, and let the gentle tide pull you toward rest. Our story tonight begins off the coast of Trinidad, in the southern Caribbean, where the charts showed only shallow inlets and mangrove creeks, yet sailors whispered of a black and bubbling sea that seemed to breathe. The first records we have of it from European mariners date to the late 1500s, when Spanish navigators, having secured their colonies along the Gulf of Paria, heard rumors from indigenous people of a great lake inland that was neither fresh nor salt water, and yet could be walked upon. To the ears of those accustomed to measuring distance by tides and stars, the idea of a walkable sea seemed contradictory. Still, the descriptions matched one strange detail that made the rumor harder to dismiss. The surface, they said, moved. Even on calm days, ripples formed, heat shimmered above it, and an occasional burp of gas released a whiff of something sharp, like resin left too close to a fire. Pitch Lake, as it came to be known in English, is a natural asphalt deposit, one of the largest on Earth. Spread across roughly 100 acres, its surface can be firm enough in places to hold a person's weight, but elsewhere will swallow a stick in seconds. For centuries, it has been replenished by petroleum seepage from deep underground. Oil seeps to the surface, loses its lighter components to evaporation, and thickens into tar. This process makes the lake seem alive, endlessly shifting its surface like slow, dark waves caught in a permanent dusk. Long before Europeans arrived, the indigenous peoples of Trinidad, including the Warao and the Carib, used its pitch to caulk their canoes, waterproof woven baskets, and seal pottery. To them, it was not a sea in the maritime sense, but a gift from beneath the earth, useful yet never to be approached lightly. By the 1590s, Sir Walter Raleigh had heard of it, and when he made his voyage to find El Dorado, he stopped in Trinidad and visited the lake himself. Raleigh wrote that the pitch was most excellent good for ship repairs, and used it to recaulk his vessels before continuing up the Orinoco River. His notes are among the earliest detailed European accounts, describing men walking far into the lake before their boots began to sink, and the pitch clinging to them in long strands when they tried to pull free. The air was hot, still, and faintly acrid, and in the midday sun the tar shimmered so brightly it seemed wet, even when it was dry enough to hold a wagon wheel without sinking. To a sailor, the sight of the lake from afar could be deeply unsettling. On hot days, the pitch would soften and sag, and on cooler mornings it could crack like parched earth, revealing veins of fresh black tar beneath. There were always bubbles rising in scattered patches, sometimes breaking with a faint pop, releasing a smell halfway between fresh pine and burnt oil. Some claimed to hear faint noises beneath the surface, slow groans or muffled splashes, which led to more than one story about creatures trapped below. The lake's edge was fringed with stunted trees and reeds, but almost no birds rested there. Perhaps it was the heat rising off the pitch, or the absence of fresh water, but to passing sailors who heard these reports, it seemed a place stripped of the usual comforts of landfall. Indigenous stories varied about its origin. One legend tells of a great feast held by a tribe that had killed and eaten the sacred hummingbird. Angered by this disrespect, the gods caused the earth to open and swallow the village, filling the hole with pitch so the people could never return. Another version speaks of it as a portal to the underworld, its bubbling surface a sign that spirits moved beneath, and anyone foolish enough to linger could be drawn down and held there. These tales, repeated to sailors in the shaded corners of coastal trading posts, made the lake sound less like a geographic feature and more like a warning. For centuries, European charts did not bother to mark it. It was too far inland to be a navigational hazard, and yet it persisted in sailors' lore as the Tar Sea or the Black Water that burns. Some captains avoided anchoring in Trinidad altogether, preferring to trade at a distance rather than risk crews slipping away to find it. Those who did visit often carried away small lumps of hardened pitch as curiosities, which would soften again in the sun and sometimes ruin a pocket or pouch. There was something about the material, warm, pliable, faintly fragrant, that encouraged handling, even as the mind recoiled from its unnatural setting. In the late 18th century, as the British tightened their hold on Trinidad, the lake gained commercial importance. Shipwrights valued its pitch for waterproofing hulls, and barrels of it began to appear in London docks, labeled simply as Trinidad asphaltum. Even then, accounts from the men who went to collect it emphasized the strange stillness of the place. The work was hot and exhausting, cutting blocks of pitch with spades, levering them up, and loading them onto carts. Men sometimes lost boots, shovels, or entire tools to the lake's grip, the tar pulling with a force that could trip even the strongest worker. Sailors stopping in Port of Spain might hear these accounts secondhand, the voices of laborers carrying over from the taverns, describing how the tar stuck to skin like a living thing. And so, despite its usefulness, the lake's reputation among seafarers remained ambivalent, half a treasure trove, half a trap. Approached in daylight, it could be a practical resource. Approached in darkness, with the night insects humming and the tar's surface breathing softly, it could feel like an intrusion into a place not meant for human feet. And so, by the end of the 1700s, Pitch Lake had become one of those curious half-known features of the Caribbean, a place not on most maps, but alive in the minds of those who sailed its surrounding waters. It sat inland, steady and unhurried, even as trade routes shifted and colonies changed hands, waiting for the next ship that might send a crew to walk upon a sea made of tar. By the time the British surveyor Sir Ralph Abercrombie arrived in the late 18th century, Pitch Lake was already a subject of whispered legend among sailors. He had heard stories from his own ship's crew before ever setting foot on Trinidad. Some spoke of a black sea that would seize a man's boots and refuse to let him go, swallowing him into a hot, airless grave. Others claimed that the lake glowed faintly under certain moons, as if the trapped spirits of the drowned burned just beneath its surface. When Abercrombie finally saw it, he noted in his journal that it was neither pond nor earth, but a thing that stirs beneath itself. The lake's surface was not entirely solid, nor was it liquid. It moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifting its own cracks shut and swallowing any object left too long in place. Fallen branches vanished after days, stones after weeks. The edges of the lake were firmer, often colonized by reeds and hardy grasses. But toward the center, the ground trembled with a strange, hollow sound if you stamped your foot. Pitch bubbles occasionally formed, releasing bursts of methane that carried a faint sulfur scent. To sailors accustomed to the clean salt air of the open Caribbean, the smell alone was enough to quicken the heart and encourage distance. What kept mariners from dismissing it as just another oddity of nature were the few accounts of animals or people trapped in its slow embrace. One widely retold tale came from a Spanish crew who ventured inland from the Gulf of Paria. They reported finding a deer mid-stride in the black expanse, its legs half sunken, its head turned as if listening for help that never came. The sailors were certain the animal was alive when they saw it, but fear kept them from approaching. Days later, when a braver party returned, all that remained was a dark, deformed hump in the asphalt, the curve of bone just visible in the hardened crust. Such sites played easily into the older Carib and Arawak beliefs about the place. In their stories, Pitch Lake was created when the people of an ancient village killed a sacred hummingbird, the messenger between worlds. As punishment, the earth opened and swallowed the village, replacing its gardens and houses with boiling pitch. The bubbling tar was said to be the remains of the village's fires, still smoldering in the underworld. The story was told to remind listeners that greed and disrespect toward nature's messengers would not be forgiven. To sailors, hearing this tale while watching the lake's surface pulse like a living creature was enough to transform curiosity into wariness. By the early 19th century, word of Pitch Lake had spread well beyond the Caribbean. Naturalists came to collect samples, which they found softened easily in the sun but hardened to rock in cooler air. Engineers imagined its uses for waterproofing ships, sealing barrels, and paving roads. In 1815, Trinidad was under British colonial control, and the administration saw the lake not as a cursed landmark but as a resource waiting to be harvested. The idea of approaching it at night, however, still stirred unease. Night at Pitch Lake was its own kind of strangeness. During the day, the tar's dark surface absorbed heat until it radiated a steady warmth into the evening air. At night, that warmth met the cooler breeze from the Gulf, creating pockets of rising mist that drifted across the lake like pale banners. Mariners who happened to anchor near La Brea after sunset described hearing dull pops and sighs from the shifting pitch, as if the earth were exhaling. Some claimed that the sound was not random but almost patterned, like distant oars dipping into water or the creak of unseen rigging. Those who visited after dark often left quickly. The tar reflected moonlight in a way that made its surface look wet and deceptively liquid, and more than one traveler lost their footing in the softer zones while exploring by lantern. Even in shallow sections, the pitch could grip a boot so tightly that it required a second-person strength to pull free. Stories circulated among sailors of lone explorers who had gone in without such help and were never seen again. Whether those tales were fact or invention hardly mattered. They had the same effect. Captains began marking their charts with cautionary notes, and the lake became a feature sailors pointed out from a distance, rather than one they approached. Still, Pitch Lake was not entirely avoided. Some ship crews came to gather its tar for emergency hull repairs. The material could be softened over a low fire, spread over planks, and left to cool into a watertight seal. Mariners who dared to collect it did so quickly, sending a few men to chip and pry chunks from the surface while the rest kept watch. These forays were always brief. No one lingered. One French trader is recorded as saying, "It is a useful devil, that lake. You take from it, but you do not stay for conversation." Geologically, what lay before them was the largest natural deposit of asphalt in the world, created over tens of thousands of years. Subterranean oil deposits seeped upward through fractures in the Earth's crust, losing their lighter components to evaporation and leaving behind the heavy, sticky bitumen. The process was slow but constant, so that the lake's surface renewed itself even as pitch was removed. Scientists who later studied it estimated its depth to be over 70 meters in places. But to the sailors and early travelers who saw only its surface, it was as unfathomable as the deep ocean, something that seemed to extend far below the reach of human understanding. The combination of the lake's practical value and its eerie qualities meant it remained lodged in the maritime imagination. Just as certain rocks and reefs were said to be haunted, or certain shoals to sing when the tide was right, Pitch Lake became part of the mental map sailors carried in their heads. A black sea on land, best treated with respect. It sat not far from the shipping lanes of the Gulf of Paria, close enough that the wind could carry its faint sulphurous scent to anchored ships on a still night. For some crews, that smell alone was enough to stir uneasy dreams. It is in those dreams, perhaps, that the lake's stranger stories truly took root. Sailors spoke of hearing their names called across the water, though no one stood on its shore. Others claimed the tar's slow, shifting patterns formed shapes, faces, ships, even maps, that lingered for hours before melting back into formless black. Such accounts, difficult to prove, were passed along in the same breath as navigational warnings and weather signs. And so the lake's reputation deepened, part hazard, part legend, something known but never entirely understood. The weeks after the British survey marked a change in the way sailors spoke of Pitch Lake. It was no longer only a place to fear, but a place to exploit, though that change did little to make men more comfortable in its presence. By the early 19th century, barrels of hardened pitch were being shipped out of Trinidad, bound for dockyards where shipwrights melted it down to seal hulls and rigging. Crews sent to harvest it often camped on its margins for weeks at a time, building shacks from palm fronds and setting up fires to keep the insects at bay. Those who worked there learned quickly how to read the lake's moods. On hot, still days, the surface would soften, swallowing boots and threatening to pull tools from careless hands. On cooler mornings, it firmed enough to walk across with relative ease. But the most unsettling times came during rainstorms. Fresh water pooled on the tar, creating mirror-smooth expanses that reflected the sky so perfectly that workers often felt disoriented, as if they were walking on clouds. The rain would hiss as it struck the warm pitch, releasing a faint steam that blurred the horizon. Sailors who had once only passed by began to anchor nearby, drawn by curiosity or the promise of steady wages, loading pitch into waiting schooners. Still, many refused to stay after sundown. Night had a way of amplifying the sounds: the soft gurgle of escaping gas, the occasional deep plop of a bubble bursting, and the distant calls of night birds. To a tired mind, these noises could resemble groans or words spoken just out of understanding. One crewman described it in his log as a place that talks only when you wish it silent. Local Carib and Wario oral histories, still told in the villages, carried a far older explanation. The pitch, they said, was the congealed remains of a feast gone wrong, when a village slaughtered and ate the sacred hummingbirds, angering the gods. The earth opened beneath them, swallowing the settlement in molten darkness. In this telling, the lake was less a hazard and more a warning, a reminder of the thinness between respect and ruin. Some elders even insisted the pitch still held the spirits of the people who sank, their voices rising on warm nights when the wind came from the south. By the late 1800s, scientists from Europe began arriving to study its composition. Samples revealed that Pitch Lake was a rare natural asphalt deposit, formed over tens of thousands of years as crude oil seeped upward from deep beneath the island, gradually losing its lighter components to evaporation. What remained was a dense, sticky mass of hydrocarbons that never fully hardened, constantly shifting and resurfacing. It was, in effect, a slow-moving geological creature, swallowing plant matter, bones, and artifacts, then spitting them back up decades later. One expedition in 1893 reportedly recovered a canoe buried in the pitch, still largely intact. Another team found tree trunks and the remains of long-dead animals, their outlines preserved in eerie detail. For sailors, these findings only deepened the site's unsettling reputation. It was one thing to fear a bog. It was another to know that the ground beneath your feet had been swallowing and regurgitating objects for centuries, without warning or pattern. When Trinidad became a hub for shipping and oil refining in the 20th century, Pitch Lake's role shifted once again. Road crews in far-off cities paved streets with its material, sometimes without knowing its origin. A stretch of London roadway, a pier in New York, and even Olympic venues in Athens were sealed with tar that once shimmered black under the Caribbean sun. In a quiet way, the lake reached far beyond its swampy edges, carrying its story into the modern world beneath the wheels of cars and the souls of pedestrians. Still, the lore among sailors persisted. Even in an age of steel-hulled vessels and satellite charts, captains passing near La Brea sometimes warned their crews not to take skiffs too close at night. Small fishing boats still gave it a respectful berth, especially when the moon was high. One fisherman told a reporter in the 1970s that on certain calm evenings, you could see small flames dancing on its surface, ignited by pockets of methane. The devil's campfire, he called it, though he admitted it might just be gas. Standing there today, you might be struck less by fear than by strangeness. The surface undulates gently, broken here and there by pools of rainwater reflecting the sky. Insects skate across them, and the occasional heron stalks along the edges in search of small fish that shelter in the runoff. There's a smell, sharp but not unpleasant, mixed with the sweetness of nearby flowering trees. If you press your ear to the surface, you might hear the quiet shifting beneath, a slow movement that has been going on for longer than human memory. The people of La Brea have learned to live with its presence. School children visit on field trips, dipping sticks into the pitch to test its stickiness. Tourists pose for photographs with boots planted in its shallow crust. Yet for those who have worked it, sailed past it, or camped beside it, the lake remains something more than a curiosity. It is a reminder that the sea is not the only thing capable of swallowing a ship, and that not all maps mark their hazards in blue. Perhaps that is why, even now, the old charts kept in maritime museums depict Pitch Lake not simply as a dot or shaded patch, but with small annotations, warnings in the margin, notes about its smell, its pull, its refusal to be tamed. A rare few are marked with an outline in black ink, as if the cartographer wanted to leave no doubt. Here be not dragons, but something just as enduring, and perhaps just as watchful. So, voyager, should you ever find yourself in the Gulf of Paria, drifting south toward Trinidad's shores, keep an eye on the water's edge. In the shimmer of heat and the play of shadow, you may glimpse that vast, black plain, pulsing quietly under the sun. You may smell its tarry breath, hear its soft gurgle, and feel, even for a moment, that ancient instinct to keep your vessel well away after dark. For some places are not dangerous in the way of storms or reefs. They are dangerous in the way of memory, slow, patient, and entirely unwilling to let go. Welcome, voyager. I see you've found your way here without a compass, which is either an impressive feat of navigation or a troubling sign for your next morning commute. Either way, you've docked at the right harbor. Before we set sail into tonight's tale, do consider leaving a like and a subscribe. It helps keep our little fleet afloat and ensures you'll always know where to find us when the tide turns. Drop a comment. Where in the world are you listening from? Who knows? We just may set sail there next. Now, loosen the sails of your mind. Let the waves grow steady and predictable, and allow the quiet pull of the horizon to guide you. Our story tonight begins in the year 1570, when the Dutch Republic was in its first stages of maritime ambition. The Dutch were not yet the sea lords they would become in the 17th century, but their ports, Amsterdam, Hoorn, and Queensland, were already humming with the sound of caulkers, sailmakers, and merchants eager to try their fortune overseas. Navigators were emerging from these waters with reputations built not just on their skill but on their ingenuity, their stubbornness, and occasionally their eccentricity. It was in such a climate that a navigator named Dirk Cornelis prepared his vessel for what was meant to be a long exploratory voyage into waters little known to his countrymen. Cornelis was, by the accounts that survive, a devoutly religious man, given to quoting scripture during shipboard disputes and keeping fast days with the discipline of a monk. Yet he was also deeply interested in the cartographic advances of his day. Printing presses in Antwerp and Amsterdam were turning out ever more detailed charts, some compiled from Portuguese sources, others from the great Iberian voyages, and still others that mixed rumor and conjecture with measured coastlines. The temptation for a navigator was enormous. Here, for the cost of some paper and ink, one could purchase the supposed shape of places one had never set eyes upon. When Dirk Cornelis outfitted his ship for his great journey in that year, he made a choice that baffled those who knew him. He purchased not one or two useful charts, but over 300 printed maps, each carefully rolled, labeled, and stored in a watertight chest. These covered regions as familiar as the English Channel and as uncertain as the Strait of Anian, that speculative passage linking the Pacific to the Atlantic in the far north. His ship's quartermaster noted in a ledger that Dirk spent more on charts than on sails. But what startled his peers most was not the number of maps he carried. It was what he refused to take. Cornelis, despite being a trained navigator, declined to bring a magnetic compass aboard. When pressed, he explained that the compass was an earthly instrument that could mislead the soul as well as the ship. To him, the will of God was the truest guide. He argued that a man armed with knowledge of the heavens, the wind, and the coastline had no need of a needle trembling in a box. If the Lord wishes us east, we shall go east, he is recorded to have said at the Horn Quay, and if he wishes us west, the compass will only tempt us to fight his will. Such statements might have been dismissed as personal quirk, but Cornelis' refusal sparked quiet concern among his backers. In the late 16th century, the magnetic compass had become indispensable to European navigation, especially beyond sight of land. Mariners in the North Sea and Baltic could get by with landmarks and a lead line, but in the open Atlantic or unfamiliar coasts, the compass was a lifeline. Without it, dead reckoning became dangerously imprecise, and errors could compound into disaster. Still, Cornelis had a persuasive manner, and his backers, merchants with more confidence than nautical expertise, were reassured by his insistence that his store of maps would serve him better than any compass. It is worth pausing here to note the nature of maps in 1570. Abraham Ortelius had just published the Atrum Orbis Terrarum, the first true modern atlas. In Antwerp, it gathered dozens of maps into a single work, each plate meticulously engraved. To a man like Cornelis, this was both a marvel and a temptation. Maps promised order, structure, and certainty in a world of shifting seas and hidden reefs. Yet they were not infallible. Many were composites of rumor, hearsay, and old charts layered over newer surveys. Coastlines could be drawn too long or too short, islands invented or misplaced. In some, great southern continents sprawled across the bottom of the page, imagined into being to balance the known landmasses of the north. For all their flaws, maps were seductive. To unroll a chart of an unfamiliar coast was to feel, for a moment, that you possessed it. That illusion of control may have been what drew Cornelis to them in such quantity. Without a compass, he could not take a bearing over the open sea, but with enough maps, he could surround himself with the image of the world as men believed it to be. The day of his departure was recorded by a few who saw him off. His vessel, a sturdy flight of about 80 tons, was provisioned for a year at sea. The chest of maps was secured in the captain's cabin, its lock newly fitted. Cornelis himself stood at the stern, hat in hand, offering a prayer as the ship's lines were cast off. The tide carried them out into the Zuiderzee, and from there, they made for the open North Sea. Where he intended to go is not certain. Some sources suggest he meant to sail toward the Caribbean, perhaps to find new trade routes or to seek out rumored coasts along South America. Others think he aimed for the Northeast Passage along Russia, hoping to connect with Asian trade without crossing Portuguese-controlled waters. What is known is that he sailed into history with his maps, his faith, and his deliberate rejection of the compass. The ship and her crew were never seen again. No wreckage washed ashore, no survivor's tale reached home. The only fragment of his voyage that ever returned was a single map, found years later in a merchant's possession in Amsterdam. It depicted a stretch of coastline unknown to European cartography at the time, complete with bays, headlands, and what appeared to be a small island offshore. Some dismissed it as fanciful decoration, others as evidence that Cornelis had reached a place unrecorded by his contemporaries. In the candlelit rooms of Amsterdam's cartographers, the map was examined, copied, and argued over. No one could say with certainty where the coast lay. Some pointed to the northern coast of South America, others to the far reaches of the Pacific. There were even whispers that the land did not exist at all. And so the mystery began. A man who trusted in hundreds of maps but shunned the simplest navigational tool had vanished, leaving behind a single chart of a place that should not have been there at all. Our story picks up weeks into Dirk Cornelis' journey. His ship, the Seagulls, was a sturdy three-masted flight designed for long hauls, with wide decks for cargo and a hull built to resist warping in tropical heat. But it carried something unusual. Stacks upon stacks of printed charts, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and stored in cedar chests to keep them dry. He had brought maps of the Mediterranean, maps of the Arctic seas, maps of the African coastline, and more than a dozen maps of the New World. Some freshly printed from Antwerp presses, others copied from Portuguese pilots in secret. What he did not have, despite the urging of his first mate, was a compass. Dirk believed magnetic needles could be corrupted by unseen forces, a superstition that had gained some traction after reports of compasses behaving strangely near the Azores. "The Lord made the heavens for us to follow," he reportedly said before departure, "and I will not be led by a stone that pretends to point." His method would be sun by day, stars by night, and faith in between. At first, conditions seemed almost to reward his stubbornness. The summer skies were clear, and the trade winds pushed the Seagulls steadily westward. By dead reckoning, Dirk could keep a respectable course, adjusting only by the angle of the sun at midday. His crew, 30 men and 2 boys, spent the early days in high spirits, mending sails, boiling salted beef in the ship's galley, and sleeping in the warm air on deck. But the ocean does not remain kind forever. 2 weeks out from Cape Verde, they hit the doldrums, a suffocating belt of still air where the sea became a mirror and the heat rose in waves from the deck planks. Without wind, the Seagulls drifted aimlessly, and Dirk's method of navigation grew more difficult. Clouds obscured the sun for hours at a time. The stars were sometimes hidden entirely. And here, where currents could slide a ship hundreds of miles without its crew noticing, a compass was the only real way to know your drift. By the second week of calm, murmurs began below deck. The carpenter claimed he heard the sea whispering at night. "Turn back." The cook, a wiry man from Zealand, said the meat was spoiling faster than it should. A bad omen. Dirk ignored them, spending long hours in his cabin surrounded by maps, tracing and retracing imagined routes with his finger. He seemed convinced that a coastline from one of his lesser-known charts, a jagged spit of land marked only as mare incognitum septentrionalis pars, was somewhere near waiting to be found. Finally, the wind returned in violent fashion. A squall tore across the horizon, snapping one of the foremast stays and sending seawater crashing over the bow. The Seagulls lurched southward, driven by winds Dirk could not properly correct without his missing compass. For days, they ran with the weather, hoping to find familiar stars. Then, in a lull after the storm, they sighted land. It was not the green, hilly coast of Brazil they had expected, nor the desert flats of Africa if they had been blown back east. This was something stranger. A low, black shoreline fringed with white surf, the smell of resin thick in the air. The surf seemed sluggish, as if it were pushing through something heavier than water. When the longboat went ashore, the crew found their boots sinking into a warm, sticky surface that rippled like tar. The sea itself seemed to end in a sheet of black pitch. They had, without knowing it, arrived at what would later be called Pitch Lake in Trinidad, though no record of that name existed yet in Europe. In 1570, such a place was not only unknown, but unthinkable. A sea that was not water, a shore that oozed underfoot. Dirk took out one of his maps, not one of the known coasts, but the strange one marked Mare Incognitum, and compared it to the jagged black line before him. He declared, in front of his officers, that they had reached the edge of a lost continent. His men were less sure. The tar-like surface bubbled in places, releasing a faint smell like burning pine. The sound it made as it shifted under their weight was like muffled thunder. Some of the crew wanted to leave immediately. They said the place was cursed, that ships might be swallowed if the tide came in. Others thought it might be worth cutting blocks of the black material to sell back home. It burned hot and slow, perfect for winter fires. Dirk refused both suggestions. He insisted on taking measurements, pacing along the shoreline with a knotted rope while the sun set behind a veil of red haze. That night, anchored just offshore, the crew heard strange noises drifting across the water. Some swore they were voices, low, drawn-out syllables that seemed to rise from the tar and travel over the waves. Others said it was the pitch itself cooling and cracking in the night air. Dirk stayed awake in his cabin, comparing the curve of the coast to his other charts. He seemed agitated, muttering about a place that should not be here and a map that was meant to be lost. When morning came, the tar shore was empty, but the wind had shifted. Dirk gave the order to sail along the coast, mapping as they went. His first mate pointed out that without a compass they could be recording everything at the wrong angle, that the land might appear upside down, backwards, or stretched when drawn against the wrong bearings. Dirk only smiled. If God wanted this coast hidden, he would not have shown it to us. The Seagulls sailed on for 2 more days, tracing the black shoreline until it faded into mangrove and shallow bays. No one knew exactly where they were. The stars suggested they were far from any mapped shipping lane. Yet Dirk kept drawing, adding inlets, headlands, and reefs to the strange chart. The last entry in the surviving copy of Dirk Cornelis' log, later recovered from a washed-up chest on the coast of Guyana, reads simply, "The land recedes, the sea deepens, but the map grows more certain." After that, there are no more notes. The Seevogel was never seen again. The following spring, the frost had only just melted from the streets of Hoorn when a fisherman named Peter van Val returned from a trading voyage along the coast of Morocco. His ship had not gone far into the Atlantic, but the voyage had taken longer than usual because of headwinds. Upon returning to port, he told a peculiar story that spread quickly through the taverns. Somewhere west of the Canary Islands, his crew had spotted a derelict vessel drifting slowly north, its sails in tatters, its masts leaning like broken reeds. They had drawn alongside to investigate, but the stench of decay and the sight of birds circling overhead convinced them not to board. What stayed with Peter most was a strange sight on the deck. A chest with its lid wide open, its contents spilling across the planks. They were maps, hundreds of them, flapping in the wind like the pages of a restless book. When Peter was later shown one of Dirk Cornelis' printed charts in a merchant's shop, he swore they were the same. But the derelict ship, if it truly was Dirk's, had long since vanished into the ocean's drifting lanes. Some believed it might have been spotted again years later near the Azores, But by then it had become part of maritime rumor, a phantom vessel that appeared only in poor weather and never close enough for a boarding party to catch. The oddest piece of the puzzle, however, came not from the sea but from the land. In 1584, a tattered book of maps was found in a small parish library in Bruges. It bore no name on its cover, but the front page carried a scrawled signature, D. Cornelis. The maps inside were curious. They were finely printed in the Dutch style of the 1560s, but many of them bore hand-inked additions. New coastlines were drawn where none should be, entire islands added in mid-ocean, and some ports relocated by hundreds of miles. On one map, the entire outline of Africa had been subtly shifted, so that its southern tip pointed almost directly at Brazil. And then there was the most controversial chart in the book, a detailed coastline labeled Nova Tenera, positioned far west of any known continent. Its harbors were named in careful script, but no such place existed on any other map of the era. The appearance of the book reignited speculation about Dirk's voyage. Some thought the additions might have been drawn from encounters with lands unknown to European cartographers, which would make them more valuable than any compass reading. Others argued they were fabrications, perhaps intended to mislead rivals, or simply the result of Dirk's personal theories about the world's shape. The trouble was, no one knew whether Dirk had made it to any of these places at all. In maritime circles, the refusal to carry a compass was seen as both arrogant and superstitious. By Dirk's time, the magnetic compass had been in common European use for nearly 3 centuries. It was not without its quirks. Its variation from true north in certain regions puzzled sailors, but it was a trusted tool. Dirk's choice to rely on God's steering, as his brother later told the Dutch East India Company, seemed to some a pious act and to others an act of folly. Among the devout Calvinists of the Netherlands, there was even a small following who admired him for it, seeing in his disappearance a kind of martyrdom to faith over instruments. Yet there were whispers of another reason he might have spurned the compass. Some claimed that Dirk had once sailed in the South Atlantic and seen his compass needles swing wildly without warning, pointing east, then west, then settling for days in a false bearing. This was not impossible. Magnetic anomalies do occur, especially near certain iron-rich coasts. But in Dirk's case, the rumor carried a darker edge. According to this version, Dirk believed the compass was not to be trusted at sea at all, for it could be bewitched by the devil or by the pull of hidden mountains beneath the waves. If true, his 1570 voyage may have been less about avoiding a human invention than about proving a point. By the close of the 16th century, the story of Dirk Cornelis had begun to blur with maritime legend. The derelict spotted by Peter van Val, the book in Bruges, and the phantom coast of Nova Tenera were recounted in fireside tales and sailors' yarns, each teller adding or removing details. In some versions, Dirk's ship was found intact on a sandbar with its maps scattered across the deck. In others, it sailed forever in the company of ghostly lights, never making landfall. The one fixed element in every telling was the absence of the compass. It became a shorthand among Dutch sailors. To go without a compass is to sail with Dirk, meaning to take unnecessary risks for the sake of pride or stubborn belief. And yet, for all its cautionary tone, the phrase carried a certain admiration too, as if acknowledging that some voyages could not be measured in degrees or leagues. Centuries later, when maritime historians tried to separate fact from fiction, the evidence remained frustratingly thin. The surviving book of maps in Bruges is real, though the authenticity of Dirk's signature has been debated. No official record of his 1570 voyage survives beyond a brief entry in the Hornport ledger listing the crew's names and the departure date. As for Nova Tenera, its coastline has been compared by modern scholars to parts of South America, West Africa, and even Antarctica, but no match is exact. A few adventurous theorists have suggested it might represent a landmass Dirk believed existed in the mid-Atlantic, a remnant of some ancient, drowned continent. Whatever the truth, Dirk's story remains a reminder of the strange choices that shaped the age of discovery. The tools of navigation were improving: better compasses, cross-staffs, astrolabes, and eventually sextants, but their reliability depended on the sailors' willingness to trust them. Some, like Dirk, preferred the guidance of wind, wave, and faith, even if it led them into waters from which they would never return. So tonight, as you drift toward your own uncharted shores, you might picture that derelict ship, adrift under a pale moon, its maps fluttering in the wind. Imagine them as soft sheets of parchment lifting and folding like the breath of the sea itself. Somewhere among them lies a coastline no one has set foot on, its harbors waiting in the quiet darkness. And whether or not Dirk Cornelis ever reached it, the shape of that land still waits, printed not in ink but in the dreams of those who, even now, prefer to sail without a compass. And perhaps, as you listen to the slow rhythm of the tide in your thoughts, you'll see that there is a kind of compass after all, one that points not north but inward, to the quiet place where the maps you carry are your own. Welcome, Voyager. Tonight we will drift to a coast where the sea and the desert have never quite learned to keep to their own borders. Before we set sail, let me make you a small promise. This is the kind of geography lesson where you don't need to take notes, unless of course you enjoy writing in the dark. You see, some maps are made in ink, some in salt water, and some in sand, and tonight's story belongs to the latter of the two. If this kind of slow geography helps you find your way to sleep, you might consider liking and subscribing. Also, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. There just may be a story along your shorelines we can tell in a future voyage. And with that, close your eyes, loosen your thoughts, and let the tide carry you out of the waking world. Our story tonight begins off the coast of Mauritania, a country where the Sahara Desert leans forward and presses its weight into the Atlantic Ocean. It is a meeting point that looks almost like a disagreement between two vast elements. One, the rolling sea, deep and blue and ceaselessly moving. The other, the desert, golden and silent, stretching in a continent-wide sweep of dunes. For most places in the world, we are used to clear borders between land and sea, but here that boundary is softened and often erased. The desert does not stay obediently on its side of the line. Each year, winds pick up sand and dust from the Sahara and carry it across the coast, flinging it far out into the Atlantic. Sometimes, the winds are so strong, and the dust so thick, that sailors describe the sky turning bronze and the ocean taking on the color of mud. The phenomenon has been noted for centuries. Accounts from early navigators, Portuguese and Spanish sailors in the 15th and 16th centuries speak of golden dust falling onto the decks of their caravels while they were still many miles from land. The men could scrape it up with their hands. Some even complained that the sand blew into their food or clogged the lines on their ships. What was most unsettling, however, was the sight of it. Rain that was not water but fine grains of earth drifting from above. To a sailor expecting clean horizons and sharp divisions between sea and sky, it seemed as though the desert itself had begun to dissolve and was pouring into the ocean. The scientific explanation, of course, is that the Sahara is the world's largest source of airborne dust. Winds sweep through its dunes and lift billions of tons of sand and silt each year, carrying them westward in plumes that can stretch thousands of miles. From Mauritania, these dust clouds move across the Atlantic, sometimes reaching as far as the Caribbean and even the Amazon basin, where they bring nutrients like phosphorus that fertilize the soil. In modern times, satellites can watch these clouds from orbit, tracing their elegant arcs as they sweep out of Africa. But for centuries, before satellites and weather stations, the only record we have is the bewildered testimony of sailors who had sand piled on their decks in the middle of the sea. The Mauritanian coast itself gives a clue to the scale of this meeting. There is a stretch of shoreline there called the Banque d'Arguin, a shallow coastal zone that lies like a pale green apron between desert and deep sea. The winds that shape this coast are relentless. They sculpt the dunes into long ridges that run inland for miles, then push the same grains outward until they ride the air. The fishermen who work these waters today still live with that constant presence. Dust settles on their nets, on the painted hulls of their boats, even on the surface of the fish they bring ashore. When European navigators first passed by this region, many were unsettled by the way the desert seemed to bleed into the sea. The Portuguese chronicler Gomes Inês de Zerara described how sails and rigging turned yellow with fine dust, as though the ships themselves had been drawn ashore. Others wrote of a peculiar haze that dimmed the sun for days at a time, making the world look not blue and gold but rather copper and brass. And in their maps, these early travelers sometimes shaded the sea along the Mauritanian coast with earthy tones, a visual hint that this was not ordinary water. It is important to pause here and imagine what this would have looked like if you were one of those sailors. You are weeks out from Portugal, sailing south along the African coast, and you have become used to the sameness of the ocean. Blue horizon, white sails, salt spray. Then, one morning, the air turns heavy and the light changes. Grains of dust settle on your arms, your clothes, the deck. At first it seems almost like ash from a fire, except it is golden, and when you rub it between your fingers it feels dry and gritty. You look around, and there is no storm, no volcano, no land in sight, just the endless sea, now colored in dull shades by the sand that falls from the sky. The effect is uncanny. It is as if the rules of the elements have been rearranged, and you are caught in a storm that belongs not to water but to earth. Modern science confirms that these events are not rare accidents. The Sahara releases dust on such a scale that it is a defining feature of the global climate. Each year, about 180 million tons of Saharan dust cross the Atlantic, feeding ecosystems thousands of miles away. The Amazon rainforest, for example, receives much of its mineral nutrients from these winds. Without them, the soils there would be quickly exhausted by constant rainfall. In a way, the rainforest is a child of the desert, living on what the Sahara surrenders. For sailors, however, this global cycle was invisible. What they saw was simply that the desert reached them where they thought only the sea should be. When reports of sandfall at sea reached Europe, many dismissed them as sailors' exaggerations, no more trustworthy than stories of mermaids or ghost ships. Yet those who had traveled the trade routes between West Africa and the Mediterranean knew better. In the coastal city of Cadiz, records from the 16th and 17th centuries mention vessels arriving from the south with decks so coated in dust that they needed days of scrubbing before unloading their cargo. In Palermo, scientists of the Enlightenment began noticing that the fine, reddish powder that sometimes stained their marble statues was not volcanic ash from Etna, as many assumed, but something more exotic. Careful examination showed grains of quartz and feldspar, typical of desert sands, and in surprising cases, even tiny fragments of diatoms, the fossilized remains of microscopic sea life, carried along from ancient lakebeds buried deep beneath the Sahara. The mystery fascinated natural philosophers. How could something as heavy and earthbound as sand travel so far? Before the rise of modern meteorology, the idea seemed implausible, but sailors, again and again, confirmed it. The winds carried the desert into the Atlantic. Their logs recorded days when visibility dropped to nothing, when the sun itself turned red as if viewed through smoked glass, and when breathing became difficult on deck. For those at sea, the dust storms were a reminder that the Sahara, vast and dry though it seemed, was not isolated. It had a reach that extended far beyond its shifting dunes. In some ways, the desert was a restless ocean of its own, with currents made not of water, but of wind. The Mauritanian coast played an important role in this exchange. Stretching between the Sahel and the Atlantic, it became a launching point for plumes of dust that could be carried for thousands of kilometers. In summer, the trade winds gathered the heat rising from the desert and swept it westward. Ships on their way to the Canary Islands or further toward the Americas sometimes sailed through reddish haze for days on end. On unlucky crossings, their sails grew heavy under a coating of grit. The rope stiffened, and sailors found their skin chafed raw as though they had spent weeks in a sandblasted workshop. But for all its discomfort, the dust also carried information. By the 18th century, European observers began connecting the dots. The same winds that pushed explorers and traders across the Atlantic also carried the desert's particles. In 1781, an English naturalist wrote of a rain in southern England that left red stains on linens hung out to dry, which he suspected came from Africa. His contemporaries laughed, until similar reports emerged from France, Italy, and even as far north as Germany. The Sahara, it turned out, was not just Africa's burden to bear. It was Europe's guest as well. These accounts give us the scientific story, but there is also the quieter human one, preserved in oral traditions. Along the coasts of Mauritania and Morocco, fishermen spoke of days when the sea tasted of dust, when the catch diminished, and when their voices carried strangely across the water, muffled as though a curtain had descended between them and the horizon. The desert and the ocean were not opposites, they believed, but companions in a dance that had been going on since long before people tried to name or measure it. Where the dunes ended, the waves began, and sometimes the dunes insisted on reminding the waves of their presence. Caravans that departed from the interior of the Sahara also felt this rhythm. The trade in salt, gold, and later slaves often linked desert routes to ports along the Atlantic. Merchants who had marched through sandstorms inland recognized the same dust when it met them again by the water. They told stories of spirits who grew impatient with being confined to the desert and leapt out to sea in search of new ground to cover. In the way these stories were told, the sea was not only a route for ships but also a canvas for the desert's restless wanderings. By the 19th century, the idea that Saharan dust could travel across oceans was firmly established. In the Caribbean, observers noted strange hazes that arrived in summer, dimming the sky and irritating the throat. The people of Barbados and Jamaica gave the phenomenon names, describing the sudden veil of brown air that arrived on winds from the east. Unbeknownst to them, the same sands that had once powdered the decks of ships off Mauritania were now drifting over entire islands thousands of kilometers away. In some years, so much dust fell that cisterns and water jars showed a thin layer of grit at the bottom. And yet, life adapted. Farmers noted that the soil, enriched by mineral deposits carried across the ocean, grew more fertile after such episodes. The desert, in its long migration, was feeding the forests of the Amazon. Scientists today confirm this connection. Millions of tons of Saharan dust, lifted into the atmosphere, travel each year across the Atlantic, depositing phosphorus and other nutrients into South America's soils. Without this supply, the great rainforest might not be able to sustain its immense diversity. What begins as a storm in Mauritania ends as nourishment for trees an ocean away. The two landscapes, seemingly opposed, one barren, one lush, are in fact linked by a chain of airborne sand. For sailors, however, the scientific implications mattered less than the practical ones. When a dustfall struck, they had to cope. Water casks fouled quickly, sails wore thin under the abrasive coating, and food supplies gathered grit that ground against the teeth when chewed. Some captains carried spare cloth to cover barrels and crates, knowing that otherwise everything would soon taste faintly of the Sahara. Yet even as they cursed the discomfort, Many found themselves oddly awed. To be on a ship hundreds of kilometers from land and find sand underfoot was a reminder of how small the divisions we draw between earth and ocean really are. At night, under a sky dulled by dust, the stars sometimes vanished altogether. Navigation became nearly impossible, forcing sailors to rely on dead reckoning until the winds shifted. Imagine the anxiety of standing on deck, unable to see Polaris, unsure of the course, and brushing grit from your eyelashes as if the desert itself had come to blind you. Yet when dawn broke, and the sun rose dim and coppery above the horizon, some described the scene as eerily beautiful, a strange merging of the familiar and the alien. It was as though the Sahara had reached out a hand and stroked the sea, leaving behind a golden sheen. The ocean where it rained sand was therefore not only a place of hardship, but also of wonder. For those who experienced it, the memory stayed vivid, passed down in logbooks, letters, and conversations long after the ships had docked. The Atlantic, they realized, was not only an expanse of salt water, it was also, at times, a drifting extension of the desert itself. The question that lingered over so many accounts of this strange rain was not only how far the desert's breath could travel, but what it meant for those who depended on the sea. Sailors in the age of sail were already vulnerable to every whim of wind and wave, and to find themselves beneath a falling veil of grit was unnerving. Some thought it a sign that the land itself was restless, spilling out across the ocean as though boundaries were being rewritten. Others suspected that the sky was testing them, reminding fragile men in wooden hulls that they sailed through borrowed corridors between two great and shifting powers, the desert and the sea. By the 19th century, the Royal Navy and merchant companies had begun logging these events with more precision. Officers described how sand accumulated on the planks of the deck, in the folds of sails, and even in the barrels of muskets. The particles, when examined, were found to be of the same ochre tone as those lifted from the dunes of Mauritania. They noted too how the skies dimmed to a hazy yellow, reducing visibility so that charts and instruments were consulted with unease. A mariner might be confident in his compass, but when the horizon blurred into a muddy haze, even the most practiced navigator felt adrift. In their letters home, some described the ocean surface as if it had taken on the desert's palette, reflecting the dust-filled air above until water and sand seemed indistinguishable. Science provided clearer answers in the 20th century, with meteorologists tracking the Saharan air layer, a mass of hot, dry, dust-laden air that forms above the desert and travels westward at altitudes of a few kilometers. Instruments confirmed what sailors had long observed. These dust storms could cross not only the Atlantic, but reach as far as the Caribbean, South America, and even North America. On islands like Barbados, researchers set out trays and filters to measure the quantity of Saharan dust settling from the sky. Each year, millions of tons of particles make the journey, some falling into the sea, others feeding the soils of foreign lands. In this way, the desert becomes a quiet, unseen benefactor, scattering minerals that nourish distant rainforests, even while troubling sailors who once mistook the falling grains for omens. The ecological consequences are vast. Dust from the Sahara carries iron and phosphorus, elements that fertilize the Amazon basin, linking the fate of one of Earth's wettest forests with one of its driest deserts. It also influences the clarity of the ocean, sometimes reducing the light available for plankton at the surface, while at other times enriching waters with much-needed nutrients. Scientists studying coral reefs in the Caribbean have even traced certain declines in reef health to surges in dust deposition, which can carry microbes across oceans. Thus, the story of the sand rain is more than a curiosity of maritime history. It is part of a global system of exchange, where air currents tie continents together in a cycle of nourishment and challenge. Still, the imagery that endured most strongly was that of sailors brushing dunes from their decks. To those who lived at sea, the decks of their ships were more than timber. They were small islands of safety in an endless expanse. To see them covered with the substance of a land they could not see, transported invisibly from horizons away, was unsettling in a way that no rational explanation could entirely ease. The line between solid ground and liquid water was supposed to be firm, and here it was dissolving, as though the very definitions of land and sea had been confused. Mariners, pragmatic though they were, carried such impressions into their logbooks with careful words, knowing that those who read them might dismiss the reports as exaggerations if not documented with precision. On the coast of Mauritania itself, the phenomenon was less surprising. Communities that had lived along the desert's edge for centuries were well acquainted with the Khamsin winds and the harmattan, seasonal gusts that swept sand into every crevice of life. Fishermen spoke of days when nets drawn from the sea came up coated not only with fish but also with fine particles that had drifted out over the water. Oral traditions told of ancestors who considered the sand-laden air to be a sign of the desert's reach, as though it were reminding those who left the dunes for the coast that they remained part of its dominion. For people who lived between ocean and desert, this mingling was not so strange. It was simply life at the boundary of two immense and unpredictable worlds. Travelers who ventured inland wrote with equal astonishment of the dunes themselves, towering waves of sand that seemed to echo the sea's own forms. They noted how caravans moved across them as ships moved across the water, guided by stars, rhythms, and memory. To those who then returned to the coast and saw sand falling from the sky onto ships, the symmetry felt complete. The desert was a sea, the sea a desert, and both were prone to crossing each other's borders when winds allowed. It was a reminder that maps, no matter how carefully drawn, could never capture the full complexity of Earth's movements. As modern climatology expanded, the dust-laden air of the Sahara was also linked to the suppression of hurricanes in the Atlantic. The dry, warm layer acted as a shield, stabilizing the atmosphere and preventing the towering clouds of cyclones from forming. To meteorologists, this revealed another paradox. The same particles that once unnerved sailors with their abrasive rain might also protect ships from encountering far greater dangers. The desert, in its distant reach, could both burden and safeguard those who sailed beneath its breath. Even today, airline pilots flying transatlantic routes report turbulence when their planes intersect with the Saharan air layer, and satellites capture ribbons of dust stretching thousands of kilometers, curling like faint brushstrokes across the blue canvas of the Atlantic. The sight from orbit makes clear what sailors once sensed only through gritty winds on their skin. The desert does not stay still. Its grains, though small, participate in journeys that bind oceans, continents, and climates together. And so the image returns, of a ship far from land, its crew emerging after a night below deck to find a strange covering underfoot. They sweep the grains into small piles, shake them from canvas, and watch them trickle through their fingers. Perhaps they wonder aloud which dune, which ridge, which forgotten hollow in Mauritania surrendered these particles to the wind. Perhaps they feel, for a moment, that they are walking both the desert and the sea at once. The boundaries dissolve, and the world feels larger and more mysterious, yet also more intimately connected. So, voyager, as you rest and drift tonight, picture yourself upon that quiet deck, where the horizon is faint and the sky carries a memory of the desert across the sea. The air is calm now, the winds only a soft breath, and the grains that once stung the eyes of sailors have settled into silence. You are safe upon your imagined vessel, listening only to the hush of waves and the gentle rasp of sand that no longer falls. Let the thought of that mingling land meeting sea, desert touching ocean, carry you into a place of stillness. The world is vast, and its elements wander farther than we think. Yet in this moment, there is only calm, and a quiet horizon waiting behind your eyelids. Sleep comes slowly, like dust settling through air, until all is quiet. Welcome, Voyager. Tonight, we drift along a coast that refuses to stay still, where the sand itself moves as if the land were breathing. This is a story of maps that could never settle, of cartographers chasing a shoreline that changed with every storm, and of communities whose lives were measured not in miles but in tides and tides' whispers. A coastline that could shift in a night, and maps that had to follow, erase, redraw, and begin again. If you are joining us from a quiet room, perhaps a window open to the soft wind, consider leaving a like and subscribing. Tell us in the comments if a nearby coast has ever whispered its secrets to you, or perhaps hid them. Coordinates, if you have them, are welcome. We love to imagine these shifting shores alongside you. If not, let us know where you're listening from. A shoreline near you may just be the destination of our next voyage. Now, settle into your chair or bed. Let your arms rest loosely at your sides. Picture a gentle breeze moving across your skin, the smell of salt in the air, waves that rise and fall without hurry. Let your eyes soften. You don't need to see yet. Just feel the rhythm. Our story tonight sets sail along the coasts of the North Sea and the Wadden Sea, where centuries of shifting sands and tidal flats turned even the best maps into fragile guesses. In this part of Europe, storms carry sand and silt in ways that seem arbitrary to outsiders. But to those who lived here, patterns existed if you knew where to look. Every gale reshaped channels and inlets, nudged islands and peninsulas, and forced mapmakers to chase an ever-changing edge. In the 17th century, Dutch surveyors and mariners faced a coastline that demanded constant attention. Sandbars would appear where none had been the day before, tidal flats could vanish under a storm surge, and new channels would open with such suddenness that entire villages might find themselves at risk of being cut off from the mainland. Maps were not just diagrams, they were survival guides. And survival depended on understanding the dance of water and sediment. The Wadden Sea, in particular, is an environment of extreme flux. Low-lying islands rise from shallow waters, then recede beneath tides. In winter, storms could carve new channels in a single night. Pilots and merchants learned to read the water, the clouds, and the sand, to understand where it might be safe to anchor, where a shoal might hide, and where a new creek would threaten the road to a harbor. Maps were drawn carefully, erased, and drawn again, yet they could never capture permanence. Local knowledge was essential. Coastal farmers, fishermen, and ferry operators memorized patterns of shifting channels and tidal rhythms. They could feel the sand move beneath their feet at low tide, hear the subtle difference in waves rolling over mudflats, and sense the edges of safe passage. In some villages, they measured time not by clocks, but by the way the water shaped the land over seasons. This embodied knowledge was as important as any chart. Early maps of the region, created by Dutch cartographers, often carried elaborate annotations noting sandbanks, tidal ranges, and channels, but the coastline itself remained a moving target. In one survey from 1620, a map showed a tiny island that, only 6 years later, had disappeared beneath the tide. Another showed a creek that became a wide channel in the next storm season. Cartographers frequently annotated maps with phrases like tempora mutantur, times change, and in this place, they were literal. Some of these maps survive today, in archives and museums, their edges frayed from repeated tracing, erasing, and copying. They are remarkable not just as historical documents, but as testaments to human patience and adaptability. One map in the Rijksmuseum shows an inlet that had changed form more than a dozen times in a single decade, each variation marked with careful looping script. The mapmaker's frustration is visible in the annotations. Lines overwritten, arrows pointing to where sand had shifted, notes in the margins about storm events. The storms themselves were formidable teachers. Autumn gales swept across the North Sea, pulling sand from shallow shoals and depositing it elsewhere, sometimes entirely blocking channels that had been navigable at dawn. Mariners knew to consult local pilots before setting out, especially after winter storms. Experienced pilots could read patterns of deposition and erosion like a language written on water and sand. They understood which sandbanks were likely to shift next, which tidal flats could conceal a channel, and how to follow the subtle clues left by the wind, waves, and sun. In some cases, settlements were abandoned or ports relocated because a storm reshaped the coast beyond recognition. Dikes and embankments offered partial protection, but the sand and water had their own will. Mapmakers had to reconcile official surveying with these living landscapes. One record from the 18th century notes that a village's harbor had been mapped twice in the same year, only for both maps to be outdated within months, forcing new surveys and repeated journeys across treacherous flats. Even today, satellite imagery of the Wadden Sea shows how dynamic the coastline remains. Islands that appear solid from above are constantly shifting. Channels deepen or fill with sand. Mudflats expand and recede, and tidal streams carve new paths. For centuries, humans have interacted with this environment, adjusting their maps, settlements, and routines to the rhythms of tides and storms. And yet, there is a quiet poetry to the impermanence. To live with a coastline that refuses to stay still is to learn humility and attentiveness. Mapmakers and sailors could not rely solely on instruments or ink. They had to listen to the water, observe the clouds, and feel the wind in ways that required patience, practice, and a kind of reverent attention to change. For a modern listener, it can feel disorienting to imagine a place so unstable, where even the most carefully drawn lines on a chart could vanish after a storm. But part of the lull is here. The coastline itself becomes a rhythm, a gentle wave of change, inviting you to let go of rigid lines and trust in adaptation. Let your breathing match the tides, slow and steady, rising and falling as the waters do. Tonight, as you imagine standing on a low dune, feeling the sand shift beneath your feet, consider how those who lived here learned to read the world without certainty. Their maps were never finished. They were living documents, erased and redrawn, as patient and enduring as the people who followed them. And just like the sand, you can let yourself shift into calmness, tracing lines of thought that move and flow, letting the story carry you into its rhythm. The challenge of mapping such a restless coast was not only technical, but human. Surveyors and pilots had to remember not just the shape of sandbanks, but the circumstances of each shift. Where had the water flowed differently after the last storm? Which inlets had deepened? Which had filled? Every observation became a mental layer added to the maps, which were themselves never static. A chart was a guide, yes, but it was also a memory, a record of countless storms, tides, and nights spent tracing lines over ink and parchment. One remarkable account comes from the town of Harlingen in Friesland, where records from the early 1700s describe a local mapmaker who would redraw the coast after every gale. He kept a log not of the weather alone, but of the sand's movements. After a winter storm, he would walk the shoreline at dawn, feeling the edges of tidal flats with his boots, noting how channels had shifted. His maps show overlapping coastlines, ghosted outlines of islands that had vanished, arrows pointing to where the sand had flowed. It was less an attempt to capture permanence, and more an act of careful attention, a negotiation with a land that refused to be pinned down. The local communities understood this impermanence in their daily lives. Fishermen adapted their nets and boats to the shifting channels. Farmers moved livestock or adjusted dikes in response to new inlets or eroded dunes. Even the paths between villages changed. A road might become impassable after a particularly violent storm, forcing residents to find alternative routes. The coastline was alive, demanding constant vigilance, and humans had to respond with patience and adaptability. In many ways, these early Dutch and Frisian navigators and mapmakers developed an intuition for change. They learned to anticipate where sand would collect, where currents would carve away mud, and how wind patterns would interact with tidal flows. Surveying instruments could measure angles and depths, but they could not read the subtle cues left by nature. Only the trained eye, foot, and hand could track this living geography. Some maps from this era show intricate annotations. One sheet, dated 1714, depicts an inlet with a note that reads, roughly translated, "Since the storm of last month, the sand has shifted. The path is safe at low tide only." Another, from 1732, marks a sandbank with multiple faint lines, each corresponding to a previous winter storm, showing the gradual migration of the bank across decades. To read these maps properly, one needed not just the chart, but a sense of history and awareness of time layered over space. The storms themselves were unpredictable teachers. Autumn gales could reshape a creek in hours. In some years, entire islands seemed to move, appearing in new positions on maps that had been considered settled for decades. There are records of pilots refusing to sail certain passages after a winter storm, trusting local knowledge over charts. In one entry from 1745, a surveyor notes that the old lines are lies. Only what the sand says now is true. Even cartographers who were meticulous in method eventually learned to integrate this impermanence into their craft. Maps were drawn in layers, with erasures and overlays, using different inks or colors to indicate past shapes versus present conditions. Some even included hand-drawn arrows showing the direction of sand drift, or dashed lines marking channels that might exist only temporarily. It was a dialogue between mapmaker and landscape, a constant negotiation of truth and change. Beyond the technical mastery, there was a human rhythm to living with such a mutable coast. Children learned to observe the shoreline like seasoned sailors. Mothers and fathers would point out subtle signs of recent storms. The color of the sand, the shape of tidal pools, the texture of newly deposited mud. Communities held knowledge not only in written maps but in stories and oral traditions, each telling of the coastline's shifting face over generations. Some early travelers, arriving from inland towns or distant countries, were confounded by the instability. Maps carried from one year might be useless the next. Harbors that appeared on a chart could vanish entirely after a winter gale. In letters to patrons, foreign merchants expressed amazement and frustration, acknowledging the skill of local pilots who could navigate what seemed like a constantly moving labyrinth. One Dutch merchant remarked, "The sea here does not forgive a false line. Only those who read it well may pass." The process of observation and adaptation was slow, deliberate, almost meditative. Surveyors often spent days walking the same stretch of coast repeatedly, tracing edges of tidal flats, measuring depths at low and high tide, noting each subtle change in sand or watercolor. They learned the patterns of storm surge, the way the wind deposited silt, the subtle bends of newly formed channels. Each map became a chronicle not only of geography, but of time, weather, and human patience. And yet, in this constant flux, there was a quiet reassurance. Those who learned to read the coastline, fishermen, pilots, and farmers, understood that change was natural. The land would move, The tides would reshape the shore, storms would erase and redraw. By paying attention, by observing carefully, humans could coexist with this mutable geography. The coastline was not something to conquer, but something to understand, to negotiate with, to respect. As you imagine yourself standing on a low sandbank, feeling the wet grains shift beneath your feet, notice the gentle pull of tides on the shoreline. Hear the distant rush of waves, the hiss of silt moving underwater. Let your breathing fall into rhythm with the ebb and flow, slow and steady. Each inhalation a tide coming in, each exhalation a tide receding. Allow yourself to feel the coast's impermanence as a kind of comfort, reminding you that change is natural and adaptation is a quiet art. Even today, coastal engineers and ecologists study these regions to understand the dynamics of sediment and tidal flows. They build models to predict changes, but the land still moves with a life of its own. Satellites reveal islands forming and disappearing, channels shifting unpredictably, mudflats waxing and waning. The lessons from centuries past remain relevant. Observe, adapt, respect the rhythms, and allow space for the land to teach itself. For those resting now in quiet rooms, imagine tracing the edge of an inlet with your eyes closed, feeling its contours as if by touch. Picture a mapmaker from 1720, bent over a sheet of parchment, inked lines carefully following the outline of a sandbank that may not exist tomorrow. Sense the patience, the rhythm, the attention to subtle cues, and let that slow rhythm guide your own mind, bringing calm, gentle focus, and a sense of safe passage into sleep. Cartographers and pilots, even centuries ago, understood that certainty was fleeting. The sand moved, the water reshaped, and only by moving with the rhythm of the land could they find safety and understanding. Each map, each tracing of a channel, was a conversation with the coastline, a dialogue between human perception and natural impermanence. Some of the most remarkable surviving maps show multiple coastlines layered atop one another. Ghosted outlines trace channels that once existed, sandbanks that shifted with winter storms, and inlets that appeared and vanished within months. These charts are a record not of error, but of a careful awareness of change. They demonstrate that knowledge is not static. It must be renewed, observed, and internalized with every new storm, just as sleep must come gently, one breath at a time. Even as modern tools replaced ink and parchment, sonar, GPS, satellite imagery, the lessons of these mutable coasts remain. Pilots still respect the wisdom of centuries, consulting historical patterns alongside real-time data. Engineers still study sediment flows, tidal rhythms, and storm behavior, acknowledging that no technology can fully impose permanence on a land that moves beneath water and wind. The past and present coexist in a subtle dialogue, each informing the other, each reminding us that observation and humility are as essential now as they were then. Consider, for a moment, the human rhythm required to navigate such landscapes. A pilot reading the edge of a channel must move slowly, attuned to the water, noticing the slightest ripple or shadow, feeling the motion beneath the hull. This attentiveness is mirrored in the act of tracing a coastline with your mind, or following the story in your imagination as you rest. Notice the ebb and flow of your own awareness, the rise and fall of thought and breath. Let them trace a pattern, as the sand and water do along the shore. In the 17th and 18th centuries, surveyors often paired meticulous fieldwork with oral histories from local inhabitants. Fishermen knew which inlets were likely to remain navigable after a storm, which sandbanks shifted predictably, and which dunes might collapse or migrate. Their knowledge was earned through lived experience, passed from parent to child, and integrated into maps that attempted to balance permanence with flux. Every annotation, every dashed line, Every marginal note reflects an intimate understanding of impermanence and continuity at once. Some villages in Friesland and Groningen adapted in ways that seem remarkable to us today. Houses were built on mounds that could withstand temporary flooding, roads were rerouted seasonally, and communal observation became a routine practice. Residents learned to read the landscape, not just the charts. They internalized the rhythm of storms and tides, becoming living instruments of geography. To navigate these coasts safely was to respect the pace of nature, to respond with awareness, and to accept that no map could ever be final. Imagine the quiet determination of a cartographer redrawing a coastline for the third or fourth time in a year. Each line a compromise, each correction a meditation on change. In their study, ink-stained fingers follow the shapes of sandbars and tidal flats. Their eyes trace the same curve repeatedly, noting differences that might mean life or death for sailors at sea. And as you picture this, allow your own mind to trace gently along these imagined contours, letting your thoughts move slowly, fluidly, like water shaping sand over time. There is a comfort in impermanence if you let yourself feel it. The coast may move, the channels may shift, and yet, life continues. Knowledge is not static. It grows, adapts, and flows. Just as the coastline requires patience and attentiveness, so does rest, so does sleep. Your breath mirrors the tide, your body the dune, and your mind can follow the shifting rhythm of story and sensation into quiet calm. Even today, the Wadden Sea teaches this lesson. Scientists track sediment movement, map tidal channels, and study storm impacts with instruments unimaginable to 17th century pilots. And yet, despite precision, the landscape retains a playful unpredictability. Islands can emerge from the mudflats, channels deepen or vanish, and a coastline can transform in ways no map, no matter how detailed, could anticipate fully. To live with it is to observe, to adapt, and to trust in the wisdom of careful attention. For those of us listening now, in warmth and safety, there is a parallel. The story itself is a shifting coastline, a gentle flow from detail to reflection, from observation to insight. Follow it slowly. Let it guide your imagination along the edges of sandbars and tidal flats, across channels visible only at low tide. Feel the patient rhythm of the landscape and let it soothe you. Picture yourself walking along a stretch of mutable coast. The sand shifts beneath your feet. Channels appear and disappear. You do not rush. You notice the patterns, the subtle signs left by wind and water. Your senses attune to the gentle motions, to the whisper of waves over mud, to the smell of brine in the air. Each step aligns with the rhythm of the land. You feel connected, steady, and calm. And in this way, the story becomes a kind of map for your own wrist. No rigid lines, no permanent markers, just gentle cues and observations guiding you towards stillness. Just as cartographers once followed the moving edges of sand and tide, you can follow the contours of your breath, the shifting landscape of thought and sensation, until sleep settles softly, like silt over a tidal flat. Let the memory of moving sands, of storm-shaped shores, of maps rewritten time and again, become a quiet rhythm in your mind. Imagine tracing the edge of a sandbar, feeling its rise and fall beneath your fingers. Picture the tide gently reshaping the land, smoothing rough edges, and carrying everything forward into calm. Let that flow carry you, slowly, steadily, toward rest. The coastline will continue its patient work, long after we leave it. And now, as you rest, let yourself drift along that same rhythm. Let the moving sands and tidal flats guide you gently into sleep. Feel your body relax, your thoughts settle, your mind tracing invisible maps of calm. Good night, voyager. May the tides you follow in dreams be gentle, the channels safe, and the shifting shores beneath your imagination as comforting as the rhythm of your own breath.